Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. Friends and familiars, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have an author that has taken classical noir and reimagined it with a neo-feminist spin. He's joining me today to discuss his debut novel entitled Bondage. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Che Joaquin Jimenez. All right, friends and familiars, we are live on YouTube, Twitch, and X with Che Joaquin Jimenez, here to discuss his recent novel, Bondage. Shane, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is a real pleasure, a real treat.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 21st day of October 2024. I discovered your book on Bookstagram and was captivated by its dark neo-noir portrayal of the seedy underbelly of existence through the story of a young woman that was born into tragic circumstances. Her grit and determination allowed her to maintain both her sanity and her soul, so to speak, kind of, relying on no one but herself. So I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I appreciate you being here to discuss it.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, this is great. This is, like I said, a real treat. Writing is such an insular thing that it's special and unique to be able to talk to someone who's read the book. And, I know you have some good insights and thoughtful questions. And yeah, can't wait to chat about it.
Outstanding. Well, let's get to it. So, for people that are not familiar with it, the book follows a young woman, and I never know if I pronounce this name correct. Is it Che Guevara?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Che Guevara Horowitz.
So the book follows a young woman named Che Guevara Horowitz. Her surname suggests Jewish heritage, while her first and middle names clearly reflect her parents' admiration for the Cuban revolutionary Che Guevara. And after an unfortunate turn of events involving her sister Emma and Emma's boyfriend, Che is sent to prison for a crime she didn't commit. She accepts this because she believes it keeps Emma safe as long as she's locked up. However, she cryptically receives an old Polaroid of her and Emma while she's in prison with no accompanying letter. Fearing the worst and determined to find her sister, she escapes prison, and that's where the story begins. So could you tell us more about the beliefs and backgrounds of Che's deceased revolutionary parents?
Yeah, very much. Very happy to. So, in writing, there's always these points where, these kind of happy points where, I'm going along with a plot line and I have a character and I'm working through the beats of the story, and I'm able to find opportune moments to integrate the interests and the kind of obsessions that I have for my own life. And so certainly extremist movements, extremist ideologies has been something I've always been fascinated with as part of the human condition as this kind of a group movement. And certainly one of those has been, for a number of years, the Weather Underground, the late 60s, early 70s. Student revolutionary movement that began, protesting the Vietnam War and then morphed into, very quickly a group that was overtly trying to violently overthrow the United States government. So while not specifically named as a member of the Weather Underground, in Bondage, certainly Che's mother was, part of one of those sort of extremist student movements from, Vietnam War era. And, while like that's interesting and fascinating in and of itself, I mean, I guess what has always uh, really sparked my imagination about those movements is the kind of trajectory of them and the sort of, the long tailwind of that. For instance, with the Weather Underground folks, there was the period where they were kind of high in the zeitgeist, right? Were protesting the Vietnam War, and there was like kind of a culture wide sort of movement. When it came to that, very quickly morphed into bombings of campus ROTC buildings and government buildings, and many of the members of the Weather Underground went into hiding for a period of years, for some of them many decades. And I was always fascinated by that less written about and less well known sort of aftermath period, that long and bitter aftermath where the zeitgeist has moved on. Many members have turned themselves in, but there are those stalwart few who hold on to this. I think kind of delusionally, right? This struggle that's kind of in the past, right? Waging a war in their own minds, that most of the world doesn't even know exists, right? So that's certainly the world, is envisioning what that life might be like. Some of the Weather Underground members had kids and raised their kids, and like they had secret identities and whatnot. It wasn't quite the same scenario as like in the book, right, where there's this compound in the middle of rural Nevada that's like this fulcrum for a lot of revolutionaries worldwide to come through. But yeah, that was the genesis of that idea, this world in which Che and Emma grew up, unknown to the state, kind of born into the movement, the now dead movement that their mother and a few others are still waging. Does that answer kind of your question and get to?
Yeah, I had not heard of the Weather Underground before. I think the first thing that popped up was some sort of a news network.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you said that took place during the Vietnam War.
That was the start of it. Yeah, certainly. But as the war tapered off and ended, and again, as I mentioned, like the zeitgeist moved on. Many of these folks who had done bombings, some folks had even died. Right? They were wanted by the FBI. Many folks went into hiding. And so just envisioning like what that long period was like. And there were some who, the Weather Underground morphed into, I think they were called the May 19th Communist Organization. It seems kind of anachronistic, but, in the late 70s, early 80s, even well into the 80s, did bank robberies to fund their revolutionary movements. And so just thinking of the kind of the mission drift of that, right? And, I guess they probably envisioned it as a commitment to the cause, right? But from the outside world, it's this this delusion that's led them into a place of murder and they kind of throwing their lives away for something that the rest of the world doesn't even, like I said, know exist, right?
Yeah.
And then so imagining three young characters with Che and Emma, and then their friend that they grew up with, Tommy. Imagining what that world is like, what the upbringing for them is like out there in the desert, being trained to wage some coming kind of prophesied war that their mother thinks is kind of just past the horizon.
Yeah, I guess it's one thing to be, what did they call that? Conscientious objectors to a war, anti-government. But then it's another to get into these paranoid, delusional worlds where it's like, okay, I'm predicting the future, or at least attempting to create some sort of self-fulfilling apocalyptic prophecy. So, yeah. And speaking of which, her mother is an ever-present nagging voice in Che's head, always urging her to be cold-blooded and follow a Machiavellian code for survival. And it's a path that Che often struggles to follow. She has a lot of empathy, and she seems like she has a pretty solid moral compass. So, despite being raised in militaristic circumstances by rebellious, anti authoritarian parents, neither nature nor nurture seemed to shape her that way. How did she grow up to maintain compassion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wanted a dual thing to be happening throughout the book, right? So there's the outer main plot line, which is, fast and frenetic and takes place in just a matter of days as Che escapes from prison and then returns to Las Vegas in search of her sister, who she thinks might just have a few days left, if she's even still alive. But I wanted that inner journey to parallel that. And it is very much steeped in her upbringing and in that the voice of her mother. I mean, by the time the book has begun, her mother's been dead for many years, but I wanted her to be a sort of living presence in the book, like this sort of disembodied ghost who is just kind of just the devil on Shay's shoulder, speaking to her in moments, guiding her along with what Shay thinks her mother would want her to do in certain situations. So there is like that kind of that push and that pull or that friction, right, between who Che is kind of fundamentally as a person, and then this extremist upbringing that has shaped her. And that upbringing, I mean, so I mentioned the Weather Underground and, that the, extremist movement to overthrow the United States. It's interesting because for Che, she's a person who's been shaped by what her mother calls like the mission or the cause, right? So there's that that end goal that all of the things are subservient to, and to accomplish that. The ends justify the means, right? Whatever you have to do to reach that point. And so it's almost like Shay has the structure of that in her mind, but she's also not beholden so much to her mother's cause, right? Growing up out in the middle of the desert like she did, she has only the vaguest sense of what the United States is, or that she even lives in a nation state, right? She's had a very kind of skewed upbringing in that sense. So which is to say, yes, fundamentally, I think she is a good and compassionate person who many of her actions have been corrupted by the ideology of her mother. And so one of the things, with that inner piece, that inner journey I wanted to show is the ways in which those things butt up against one another and how ultimately Che learns to discard that ideology from her mother. But she still has that kind of superstructure of the mission, the cause, that all things, any sacrifice is worth the kind of accomplishing that, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it's like she replaces one mission for another kind of in the course of the book. It's tough I don't want to get into spoiler territory too much, but yeah, so it's hard to talk about. But anyways, that was kind of the goal there.
Gotcha. Well, kind of hearkening back to the idea of paranoid, delusional, apocalyptic beliefs, Che's first stop is the off-the-grid compound where she grew up that you alluded to speak with a man named Dave, who was an associate of her parents, who was tasked when they were younger to be the one to train them in guerrilla warfare. So this made me think of Charles Manson. While Charles Manson didn't share the same views as Che's parents, he did hold revolutionary political beliefs that were conspiratorial, paranoid, apocalyptic, all of the above. So was the Spawn Ranch an inspiration for the compound, and are there parallels between Manson and Che's parents' often paranoid and apocalyptic beliefs?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. And to be honest, I had never really thought about that parallel. I can totally see the ways in which those two things line up. It wasn't, I would say it wasn't at least a conscious parallel in drawing that. I'm aware a bit of the Manson family and, the murders they committed and a bit of the ranch just through like imbibing that through the culture. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, right? Just the dark side.
You can't get away from it.
The hippie movement. Yeah, totally. So yeah, I'm aware a little bit of that, but not so much in what their ideology, if you even want to call it that, was. I guess I think of them more as a sort of corrupted death cult guru sort of situation. I mean, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but I recall a little bit of, I think it wasn't part of Manson's thing that he thought some race war between white and black people was inevitable. And he's trying to bring that to fruition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was trying to hasten a race war called Helter Skelter.
That's right. Okay. So, the Beatles song. Yes. Okay. Coming back into.
I don't know if you're aware of this. They were sending him messages through their music.
That's right. Yeah. They shouldn't have done that.
They shouldn't have done that. It's caused problems.
But anyways, I mean, that's a super interesting parallel to draw. And, and I think it's just, there was just something in the air of that time, right? That's the same general kind of point in history. I would say, I mean, it's interesting because I think from the point of view of Che and Emma's mother and her sort of colleague, Dave, who's kind of a ex-biochemist building bombs out there in the desert. I mean, I think they think of their end goals as idealistic and as righteous. Maybe the Manses did as well. I don't know. I think from the outside, it's an interesting parallel because from the outside, the average person probably wouldn't be able to draw much distinction between the two of them, right? And and it was an interesting thing to write about, Che's mother and their ideology, because I don't necessarily, I don't believe in the goal or the means that that they're undertaking to bring that about, right? So it's an interesting thing. I didn't know if anyone would kind of find sympathies there, but it's like to put yourself in the mind space and put yourself entirely in the point of view of that character with that very skewed, interesting upbringing was kind of a strange mental space to put myself into for the too many years it took to write this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, Che gets creative and convinces, and creative, I should have done air quotes, gets creative and convinces Dave to reveal where his son Tommy, which was Emma's boyfriend, is. And after eluding the police and reaching Tommy, she learns horrific details about Emma's disposition. So with little to go on, she sets out to find a famous comedic celebrity named Buddy Flowers. So just based on what I know about this character from reading the book, was he in particular and in general the inclusion of a beloved comedic TV star who was known for family shows, influenced by recent scandals involving celebrities and the hardships faced by child stars? And if so, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, and yes, totally. Generally, the genesis of this book goes back many years and spent a lot of years writing it. And so certainly, though it could be interesting, right? It's going through this experience, having written this novel and put this novel out there. It's like I'm constantly trying to remember what the kind of the headspace I was in, many years ago while writing this. And sometimes it could be a little bit of kind of mental detective work. But the genesis of this book was certainly around the start and kind of the heyday of the Me Too movement. And you had story and scandal after scandal, and you had Harvey Weinstein, and you had any number of folks, and that's continuing right to today, right? I mean, you look at the headlines and just like the celebrities caught up in these kind of dark and twisted, dealings, right? So certainly that was kind of a big kernel there. I mean, I think it's ripe material insofar as just the very nature of celebrity, right, is surface level and vapid, and increasingly so, right, and PR driven and market. So it's like you get these mega celebrities, and then there's a whole team of people carefully cultivating a certain image that's presented to the world, right, and thinking of I was envisioning something that I found, like a villain that I found horrifying and personally scary, was someone who had that machine behind them, who had that, that certain mask in society, but deep down was evil and sadistic, and had the means and the power to indulge those impulses and to hide their effects, if that makes sense. I think thinking back to that time, 2016, 2017, when I first started dreaming up this book, not to get too much into like the grim dark reality, things
this is the
that
Dark
haunts,
Mind podcast.
exactly. In concert with that was the 2017 Las Vegas shooting. I wasn't living in Las Vegas at the time, but I lived there for many years. I moved there as a teenager. I just turned 13 when we moved there, and I had family that lived there, and left finally when I was 21. So the city occupies a big part of kind of in my history and my heart. And there was something about the nature of that shooting in 2017 when that madman went up into the upper floor of Mandalay Bay and shot down at the music festival below, that kind of blended with some of the the celebrity scandals and kind of evil things that we're talking about. And so far as and this really scares me, it was that sense of not understanding like the why or the impulse there, right? I mean, there's something when you see that kind of human behavior, like a mass shooting or like a Jeffrey Epstein kind of situation, right? There's something like that's the most terrifying thing in the world to me, probably, because it is such an alien kind of impulse and kind of place to be in. I just can't imagine being in that mind space where you find any kind of gratification or any impulse to do that. And so I find that terrifying, the kind of black box of the mind, right? The unknowable kind of aspect of human interactions, right? Like you can't truly ever know what's going on in a person's head. And that's fine in a day-to-day sense, when you assume that everyone is like kind of a relatively normal person operating in good faith, right? But it's terrifying to me to think of folks who hide that, right? And who do have the impulses and the power and the money, like someone like Buddy Flowers, who is this sort of ex-TV star, entirely fictional, and the show's entirely fictional. And it was a lot of fun, and I guess in a way to like kind of craft little snippets from his show, which I imagine one of those stupid early 90s sitcoms that would play after Family Matters or something. And so just the duality of that I wanted to play with, someone who to the world was like America's uncle who loved football and hot dogs, but deep down, yes, has this hidden basement / torture chamber, and has these kind of dark secrets he keeps within that Che ultimately stumbles upon in the course of the book.
Yeah, the thing about Epstein is, whenever people used to come up with these wild conspiracy theories, I used to be able to just blow them off like, yeah, whatever. And then this crazy conspiracy theory comes. I mean, it's right there in black and white, out for everybody to view. There's these weird circumstances surrounding his death. So it's like, now anytime I hear some weird conspiracy theory, I'm like, yeah, it's possible.
Yeah,
I can't ever blow that off again.
Yeah, and that's the scary part of things like that, or I feel like the truly dangerous or corruptive part to things like that, right? Because it lends credence to the 9/11 deniers, the Sandy Hook deniers, the Pizzagate folks, right? Because they can point to real credible things that have happened in the world, right? So that's doubly dangerous in that way.
Yeah. Well, while trying to leave the trailer park where she found Tommy, Che had to think fast to evade the police. And I won't spoil what she did, but what she did was a very clever, low-tech move that would definitely work in the real world. I was reading it like, yeah, man, I see what's about to happen here. This is amazing. So I remember as a kid, you could order all sorts of survival guides and CIA manuals from magazines like Soldier of Fortune. I don't even know if that magazine still exists, but one of the notorious ones was the Anarchist Cookbook. So did you consult any of these types of books for the guerrilla tactics, I should say, in this story?
Yeah, it's interesting. I totally remember those magazines too. Yeah, Soldier of Fortune. I imagine that exists maybe still in some way on the internet. I don't know. As a kid, it would seem in the magazine racks, when I was going through pro wrestling magazines or video game magazines, in the 90s. I did a lot of like Google poking around. I didn't, I looked at little snippets or extracts of the Anarchist Handbook. Didn't do any deep dive into any one particular like book or tome or magazine or lifestyle there, but certainly try to put myself in the headspace of someone like Che, who had that kind of knowledge base and that upbringing where she could get herself out of certain situations with her kind of messed up, militant MacGyver like know-how. But certainly it was kind of a moment. It was like a dual thing. It's like, when I encountered a certain problem in the narrative, like I kept, intentionally writing myself into these kind of like dead ends, right? Like, how is she going to get out of this sort of situation, right? Unscathed. And oftentimes she doesn't come out unscathed. So, I would do research into different DIY sort of incendiary technologies or.
Oh God, you're on a list now.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so there are moments where you're Googling that kind of stuff, right? Like how to make a bomb out of XYZ, right? So yeah, that's funny. And then also, some of it too was like, like Che has had this upbringing and she knows guns. I don't know anything about guns, and so there's just like there's the functional aspects of that to make it, to get yourself into and out of certain plot threads. But then there's also, we're close in on Che's point of view throughout the whole book, except for those brief moments where we switch to like other kind of points of view of different folks like involved in the story, right? And so you want it to be familiar, and you want it to be believable in terms of like this is the way that she looks at the world and operates through the world. She sees a gun. She doesn't just see like any kind of nameless gun, right? But she sees a certain make and model, and if there's a problem with it, she knows how to take it apart and fix it. And not only that, but there's a certain kind of comfort and familiarity for her in those kind of moments, right? There was, I'm sure in talking to other writers, you talk about killing your darlings and those kind of tough editorial choices you have to make, and oftentimes I feel like I'm in a good editing place when I am deleting my favorite lines and I'm like deleting my favorite scenes, because I feel like, okay, I'm doing these kind of necessary excisions, kind of in pursuit for like, the best kind of story in and of itself, right? But there's, one or two scenes in there where I for the services of the plot, I thought, okay, maybe I can pare this down. I can hone this to the bone a little bit more. But I left a lot of that language in there, thinking through, Che is in this really tough, traumatic, crazy kind of week of her life. And these moments where she does clean a gun probably would remind her a lot of growing up and of her mother and of learning those things. So there's a kind of perverse meditative thing to that for her, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the mindfulness, I think it's called oryoki, when you're doing Zen meditation. Seated is zazen, but they do this thing where they mindfully eat rice. So kind of the meditative act of field stripping a gun, I'm sure, is probably what she would engage in.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I've never heard of that, but I love that. That's great.
Yeah. Well, Che eventually makes it to a library to use the internet to locate Buddy Flowers' residence. She finds his mansion vacant, so to speak, but upon exploring, she discovers an underground chamber with a coffin where she assumed unspeakable things took place, and it turns out she was correct. After going through a collection of VHS tapes, she finds a video documenting her sister Emma being slowly tortured in the form of isolation and starvation in the solitary confinement of the chamber. So the coffin in the underground chamber is a powerful symbol. Was it meant to be symbolic? And if so, what does it represent in your story? What did it represent to Buddy Flowers when he was inflicting this torture?
That's a good question and gives me a lot of food for thought. I mean, I think, by its nature, it's very much symbolic. Just in terms of its kind of outward nature, it's a depiction of just the sort of depravity and the kind of the hidden, evil evident in this house, right? That's buried, so you have like a a coffin in a hidden subterranean chamber. You have a box within a box, right? But it's very much, as well about those secrets and about the sort of black box of the mind. The unknowable secret thing buried beneath your feet in an otherwise, perfectly acceptable home, right? That you wouldn't guess like harbors these dark secrets. And it's interesting because it's like, the nature of it just sort of came out organically in the writing. And so when you ask like what it represents to someone like Buddy Flowers, it's almost like I truly don't know, and that's what scares me, because I don't know. I mean, there's something there, right, about power, about that psychological and physical torture of bending someone to your will. That's one of, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't linger on these sort of things, but that's one of those things that's obviously out there in the world, in the psychology of not only other individuals, but people with real power. And it's something that I don't understand, and that horrifies me. And then so, having that as a central symbol, and also, point of connection for Che, when she sees her own sister, right, subjected to that, was kind of the horrifying motivating force there. I find myself, writing about the things that scare me the most, writing about the things I don't necessarily want inhabiting my headspace, but are there. And, maybe it sounds cheesy or something, but there's something kind of, the writing about those things, I find kind of like this exorcism. It's not that it alleviates that concern or that fear I have in the world, but it helps it not kind of sit as heavy in my heart, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, not to belabor the point, but kind of trying to get further into Buddy Flowers' brain. In the video, he kind of just watches Emma suffering in a detached manner. There are some cryptic things he says. What drives Buddy's twisted form of voyeurism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I guess, superficially, there's something there about just the kind of broken psychology of him, right? I mean, there's this, there's one point early on where we take this kind of brief journey into his point of view, and in his I guess I don't want to say too much, but to his point of view and to his psychology, in this, and it's he is someone who feels at home in the world and feels like he has these kind of unspeakable desires, but instead of trying to run away from them or bury them, he accepts them, and he has also attained the means and the power and the money to indulge them, right, to his kind of heart's fulfillment. So I guess, I mean, again, not to be repetitive, but I guess it is that kind of unknowable nature of what would drive a person like that I find the most horrifying. And Che is a kind of cipher for me, I guess, in that moment. I mean, in almost every other way, I feel like she's very, very different as a character than I am. But I think it's what horrifies her the most too, the not understanding of what would drive a person like this, and then that leads her into, don't want to jump too far ahead, but it leads her into the folks that Buddy is connected with that have enabled, the organization that has enabled him to do, these things that he's done, and the sort of, there's kind of a larger structure, larger power system, larger, entirely male kind of view and kind of violent behavior that Che encounters, that she ends up fighting against.
Yeah. And let me take 1 second to welcome the live listener we have on Twitch. Thank you for tuning in. Well, so circling back to the book, after briefly resting at Buddy Flowers' mansion and evading the police, Che awakens to a masked assassin specifically targeting her. She doesn't know who he is or who sent him, but she uses her training to drive him off. After such an intense scene, how do you manage the pacing to give readers a breather while keeping them engaged? Because there's the real dark, emotional, introspective moments that you would expect from noir, neo noir. But there's also some pretty intense action.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like the daily challenge, when you sit down to write, especially when it comes to long form fiction like this. It's my first novel. I've written a lot of short fiction, and I feel like if you write 10 to 20 pages, you have a lot more leeway to get away with, just different kind of modes, different sort of paces, right, within that story. But in a long piece, especially like one like Bondage, which I envisioned as this kind of frenetic, breakneck sort of paced thing, right? It's like, the worst 5 or 6 days in someone's life. I definitely was mindful, and that was like the challenge in trying to punctuate that, right? So that it is, for Che herself, it is a whirlwind, crazy experience, right? This week that the book encompasses. But you can't. I don't know if I can sustain that for a reader for 300 pages, right? So I found those were moments where where I wanted to pull back a little bit on just the pure plot and the action, to introduce bits of Che's backstory, moments of remembrance from her mother and her family, always trying to tie them together sort of thematically, or have a kind of like symmetrical resonance between the two, if that makes sense, right? Like one is sort of forming the other. It's yeah, I mean, it's an ever-present challenge. I find, this book, I thought a lot about plot and about plotting out a book in a way that I never have before as a writer. Like I've always come at writing, I don't want to say intuitively, because I would focus on craft, but like, from the level of the sentence, from language itself, that's how I fell in love with writing. So with this book, I wanted to focus a lot on just the pure kind of story and mechanics of this, and then kind of blend that, but also, have like an even balance between those moments where maybe I'm going into Che's kind of maybe I'm rhapsodizing a little bit and going into Che's mind and backstory, and then just having like also the propulsive plot that's happening as well. So again, it's just like it's just a challenge of writing and of editing, of noticing moments where I feel like maybe I am rhapsodizing too much, and I can cut back on things that I feel are crucial to Che's history, but maybe maybe they just inform me as the writer, right? And maybe the reader doesn't have to get all these little snapshots. And then also kind of on the flip side, those moments where the story is just getting maybe too action heavy for too long. This is happening and this is happening. It's like, okay, can I have a moment to pull back, even if it's just within Che's head for a few moments, but for a few pages, the reader kind of retreats into some kind of resonant, memory or touchstone for her.
Well, to kind of continue forward, the intrigue deepens when a shadowy mafia-like organization enters the story. And I don't know if you can answer this. If it's going to reveal a spoiler or it's something you want to, keep from people, feel free to pass. I was just curious to know, was this like organized crime mafia style group, or was it a group like that? Did they run drugs? Like, can you talk a little bit about them, or are they like this secret brotherhood style organization, some underground Epstein government operation?
Yeah, kind of all of the above. Like at their core, they are that just kind of classic Vegas mafia sort of organization, right? Which is like, entirely fictional. Like I don't know this world, but as far as I understand, that doesn't really exist in Las Vegas anymore. But I'm playing with certain tropes there, and certain kind of touchstones a reader might have there. That certainly is one. It's like talking about that balance between revealing too much and being clear for the reader. I mean, that is one area I ended up drawing back a lot in the course of the book. I in my head and on the page, I originally had a lot more of the mythos of this organization, which is, I kind of thought of it as the mafia, but with that conspiratorial, even kind of occult edge, the little kind of glimmers you get in the book. There's, an image of an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail. That seems to be some kind of like flag, that they have.
Yeah.
And I ended up exploring kind of the mythos around it in some other short fiction. But I definitely wanted to pull back, in the course of the book on, because most of it is from Che's point of view, and most of it is mysterious and confusing to her. So I wanted to create that almost like kind of Kafkaesque feel of the disoriented individual entering, these circumstances she can't possibly fathom, but having to navigate that at her own peril, right, to rescue her sister.
Yeah. Well, no noir story is complete without a private eye. So enter John Navarro, a former Las Vegas PD detective skilled at spotting lies, but in Che's case, he ignores the red flags due to his desperate financial situation. So in classic noir, private detectives often have world-weary cynicism. How does Navarro embody or subvert this archetype in your story?
Yeah, I think that's like an astute observation and question. I think with many characters, including him, I was playing with certain, familiar tropes that someone coming into crime fiction or noir or neo-noir is familiar with. And so he certainly embodies a lot of those, right? Like he's this ex-cop who is now disgraced and his life is a mess, and he runs this kind of bare bones PI shop. He's always in debt and out of money, which is why he's even when Che comes to him and kind of brings him into the this mystery and this procedural is the only reason he accepts that, as you said. But I wanted to put kind of unexpected twists on these tropes and on these kind of stock characters, and so. And also wanted to simultaneously, this is a kind of a grim book in many ways, right? And so like I saw the PI as an opportunity to kind of pull back a little bit from that and lighten the mood. And so he is someone who, paradoxically is this kind of world-weary, cynical ex-cop, but at the same time has a certain lightness to his touch in the way he approaches Che and other characters. He is, he's funny. He's, he looks at things like not too warily, despite his experience. So for both, as for myself, and I think for the reader to kind of lighten the mood a little bit with this inclusion, that was kind of one goal there. Also, to give Che a kind of foil, like a kind of colleague, but also a kind of someone who doesn't trust her at all, and also someone to kind of provide, because Che is such a skewed kind of point of view, to provide someone with more of like a real world grounded kind of point of view to kind of encounter this increasingly fucked up situation, right, that Che is being pulled into. Anyways, those were some of the motivations behind that character.
Yeah, and he had some darkness to himself too. I can't remember if he was technically fired or what happened. I won't say why, leave that for the reader to find out. But, he had some issues himself. So cynical from the job, and maybe, I don't know if that was the cause of it. His, well, I'm getting into spoiler territory. Let's move on. Well, so Che hires Navarro to find Joey Mendoza, a.k.a. Creepy Joey, after learning he might know the whereabouts of her sister. And I hope I got this right, because I read it a few times to make sure that I was getting my details straight. Her sister, who is reportedly using the stage name Roxy at the local strip club. That's what she was told, correct?
Not quite. So there's just like another layer of connection there. So Roxy is a different character that she comes across in the strip club, who is Che found a matchbook of that club, and that was the one thread that she had to try to find someone who might be connected to her sister. Her sister,
Oh,
though, not to get in spoilers, is connected to the club in some fashion. Yeah.
yeah, I know that. Okay, so was Roxy the person that she was in the car with?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Well, one thing I wanted to ask about was the strip club itself, because, often in stories, settings become characters. And not all strip clubs are seedy. Some of them can be very glamorous, but in noir stories, they often symbolize the underbelly of society. So, what elements of a strip club do you enhance and exaggerate to give it that dark, cynical feel in your story?
Yeah, I think that that's very true, and that's like the city itself, Las Vegas, and the different kind of places Che is pulled into. I think they are characters in and of themselves, and part of this kind of larger geographical character that is part of the story. And so I think with that, I am playing into certain tropes, from noir stories, because it's like personally, I don't feel any kind of judgmental lens towards strip clubs or strippers or people who, consenting adults who frequent, those kind of
Mhm.
establishments, right? I wanted, it seemed natural that if the organization that's what's called like kind of the mob like kind of group that Che is both pursuing and being pursued by, if they were going to have any sort of real world front kind of businesses, a strip club seemed like a natural kind of location for that. And at the same time, it provided like moments where I could kind of, amplify some of the thematic, atmospheric stuff happening in the background around, the male gaze, that voyeuristic male, gazing at women in a way that in the strip club in and of itself maybe is more innocuous or more innocent, right? But there's chance to amplify that sense of men watching women with hungry eyes, which is then connected to the work that the organization does with part of the work they do with abductions and that kind of other grisly and savory stuff.
So, a prominent character in the story isn't human, as we were talking about. Sometimes settings become characters, sometimes vehicles become characters. In this case, a barracuda. So, what's your connection to this car and what inspired you to include it in the story?
Yeah, it's funny. Recently one of my friends who read the book was like, "Oh, I didn't realize you loved guns and cars so much, Shane." Because it's not part of my everyday vocabulary, and it wasn't. It's like I'm notoriously car blind. My wife is always laughing at me. I'm trying to get into like the wrong car or something because all cars look the same to me, even my own. So this was, in thinking through. So the car belongs to our character Bobby, who's sort of like the muscle of one of the muscles of the organization, the sadistic macho character. And thinking through, like what kind of ride would he have? A vintage 70s kind of muscle car seemed primed for him. And so, I think it was the dual thing of, the Barracuda itself, when I kind of did some research into, muscle cars of the era, seemed to like totally fit his character. I love the name of it as well, like the sort of predatory kind of connotations of it. And also there's like a subversion there that I was hoping to kind of pull off. So Che ends up at a certain point stealing the car and driving the car. And so I wanted working within this neo-noir genre to have these sort of subversive moments where, she is not the disempowered or, disempowered victim or the femme fatale, even though she has to often use her sort of her wits and her guile to get out of situations as opposed to her muscle. But I wanted that kind of twist of that trope where she is now the one, guiding the situation, or she's taken on, these trappings. She wears, this leather jacket she got from Creepy Joey, another character, right? She shaved her head. She's driving this Barracuda, right? Like she is like which is like, the personification of this kind of muscular male sort of thing, right? she's become, like, in the course of the book, this sort of, badass protagonist, who is, again, doubling back to what we were talking about in the beginning, dedicated to the mission kind of at all cost, and willing to do whatever she has to do, and burn down the whole world, to help the one person she wants to help in the book.
Absolutely. Well, the speaking of predatory, the driver, Bobby, is a ruthless character with a traumatic childhood who, as an adult, it's very strange, enjoys both being violated and committing murder. What drives his extreme obsession with, basically passivity and dominance?
Yeah, it's, in the composition of the book, part of it is just, wanting to conjure to life these well-rounded characters, and we are contradictory and we contain all kinds of things. And so it's taking these, either these stock characters that folks might be familiar with, or these certain traits, and putting a twist on them, right? Or blending different things together, right? And so there is that in Bobby. And it's, I don't know in the writing of it if I interrogated kind of my own thoughts on it too much, but I think there is something there also with, Bobby is the most predatory of them all, and is the kind of the attack dog that's, like, sent by the organization to, commit its most sort of violent crimes. And so I think there is something there with the duality of, he is a predator. He's had a traumatic childhood, so maybe there's something there as well. But also with the sort of, I think the scene you're alluding to, there's this sort of ritualistic, depiction of him being the victim, right? Or being victimized, or however you want to phrase it, right? In one moment, or not maybe victimized so much as giving up dominance to another person, right? In that moment sexually. So I don't know. I thought it was kind of an interesting twist, for that character who otherwise is, both in that, and also with, there's a moment later on where we get into his head and his backstory, where I wanted to just deepen what otherwise is just a kind of a figure of dread and of violence and carnage in the book.
Yeah, the backstory, the aspect of his father, I can totally see that producing the violence, but there wasn't anything that I don't remember that would kind of coincide with the sexual thing. Is that right? Or okay?
No, not really. Yeah,
we'll leave that up to the imagination.
Yeah, I don't want to be too. I don't know. It's like, a work of fiction needs to be a kind of clockwork mechanism, right? Like, everything needs to cohere together. There's a part of me somewhere in the back of my head that's like, sometimes people just have kinks, and who knows where it came from, right?
Yes, indeed. Well, your novel explores complex themes like morality, survival, and power. Do you draw any conclusions or make any concrete statements about any of these elements in the story?
Yeah, that's wow. That's a deep question. And I think we've touched on some of these things. Yeah, like power and dominance, and I think in my writing I'm always drawn to the powerless. Those who are outside of the bounds of normal society. Those who don't have any agency. Those who are kind of lost in this, Kafkaesque world they don't understand, where everything's kind of set against them. So, that is like the thrust of the book, right? Che is someone who is, extremely marginalized on the edge of society growing up, and then escapes from prison and has that dual sort of sense of anxiety, right? The police are after her. There's a statewide manhunt for her arrest. And she's also has the urgency of trying to find her sister, who's been abducted by this shadowy person and shadowy group. And so there is, definitely wanted to explore that sense of the powerless person fighting against, the kind of the tidal wave of things set against them in life, right? Not giving up, but at the same time, I didn't want to sugarcoat that journey too much, right? And the sort of positive outcomes of that, and that if she's willing to sacrifice everything to accomplish her goal, like I wanted that to be certainly on the table, and to kind of spell out what that is to sacrifice yourself for something greater, which I think is what, how she has grown up and what the kind of beliefs her mom has instilled in her. But I think one of the big inward journeys for Che in the book is discovering, that thing found by herself that she's willing to sacrifice for, not externally imposed on her, if that makes sense.
Well, are there any classic noir films or novels that have influenced your work?
Yeah, so many. In writing, it's interesting because I never thought of myself as a crime writer before writing this book. I've always been interested in noir, but stuff I read was maybe a little more, I don't know, literary. Not as overtly plot based. But I've always loved noir. I've read a lot of the classic noir writers. Hammett and Raymond Chandler. But certainly been more influenced by classic film noirs. Especially I love the works of Orson Welles. All the works of Orson Welles, but those that cross into the noir territory, I think, are just amazing. I can just rewatch those movies over and over again, for the rest of my life. Things like The Lady from Shanghai, which is amazing. Touch of Evil, which is an incredible movie. He didn't write it, but he wrote a kind of a central speech in it and has an amazing performance in The Third Man, which is a great movie written by Graham Greene. But certainly, yeah, like those classic noirs are influential to me, but as are like a lot of 70s and 80s neo-noir films, the works of, Brian De Palma. There's kind of a spate of movies, I feel like, in the 70s, especially in the 80s, that cross these genre lines that I find really fascinating, that combine high and low art, the slasher and the cheap kind of voyeuristic sort of lure to some of these films with, the kind of the atmosphere and the existential thematic, stuff, right, of classic noir. And then, I don't know if folks consider this like noir or neo-noir, but, in terms of books, I mean, I love everything I've read by Cormac McCarthy is amazing and stellar and life-changing. But in particular, I mean, it's very different than a lot of his earlier stuff, but No Country for Old Men as a book is something that I return to over and over and over again. I find it to be, for the kind of stuff I want to write, just like the perfect book in terms of being that mashup of a good kind of Hollywood, propulsive page-turning plot, and also just, I don't know, the philosophical themes of it, and the writing style that is at once, really, can be lyrical and beautiful to read, but also just like stripped down, like utterly to the bone. So that's when I find myself returning to that over and over again. I have to like not read it while I'm actively working on a project, right? Because I find myself just kind of creeping into that mode.
Yeah, with regard to Cormac McCarthy, I would say totally that Southern Gothic kind of qualifies for noir. I even heard somebody, it was odd, they would not refer to anything as Southern Gothic. They always called it rustic noir, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is. I've never heard that term before.
Well, so I was looking on your, I believe it was your Instagram feed, and I'm really interested in your love of giallo and its specific influence on your work.
Yeah, that's a kind of genre that I find myself learning more about. It's, I don't know, maybe I'm drawn to it because I feel like it mirrors a lot of things that have guided my own writing. So I don't know if I can, I still want to learn more about that mode of, the Italian movies of, I don't know when the classic period is, 60s, 70s, 80s, somewhere around there, right? Horror films that combine police procedural detective kind of elements and slasher elements, and also a kind of elevated artfulness, to like the film style and film quality and the writing and atmosphere and all of that. So I don't know if specifically those kinds of movies have guided my writing because I'm still like learning. I've seen a few films by Dario Argento, but still there's a lot more for me to watch and learn from. But I guess what draws me to it is that, the kind of same thing I find myself returning to in my own writing is that that blending and twisting of high and low art, of combining different genres that might be seen as kind of disparate, right? Like indulging in the gory slasher kind of elements of genre fiction or 80s B movies, which was like, my bread and butter growing up, with the sort of things I might, more like high art or elevated of, focusing on language and beautiful turns of phrases and, drawing, focus on atmosphere, I guess, right? And lyricalism.
Awesome. Well, when you work with editors or beta readers, what kind of feedback is most useful for you in the neo-noir genre?
Yeah. I welcome all kinds of feedback, and I try to get when I'm workshopping a piece, just like kind of a plurality and a diversity of different opinions. And I find it all helpful. And I've been at this game long enough and written so many bad things that it's just like I feel like I have this kind of thick skin towards critical feedback, and I really desire it. Whenever I hear anything positive when it comes to beta readers or editors, it's almost like I almost feel like they haven't looked at it or pried it open, hard enough, right? Because it's kind of a strange thing writing, where it's deeply, intensely personal, right? It's like these things that just start out as these, these dreams or lines or characters in your head, right? But once it hits the page, I feel like I'm in service to creating the best possible thing I can do before whenever that is that I kind of give up and move on to the next project, right? Like nothing's ever finished. It's just kind of abandoned at a certain stage, right? So it's, I love for my work to just be torn apart and just to, I love folks who can engage with it on a craft level, but I think also like we ultimately engage with all stories in all different modes, right? Whether it's written or on the screen or on the stage. Just emotionally, right? I feel like that's like the first reaction that you have to a piece of art. And so just even if I can get people's just raw emotional response to it, I didn't like it. It didn't work for me. This piece is kind of there, or I liked this person, or I didn't like this character, right? I find all that's super helpful. I feel like maybe I'm getting somewhere finally when I get to a point where it's less the reader, critiquing how I did something or how I didn't quite bring something to life. And they're more like arguing with the characters and the choices they're making. Right. Like maybe they didn't like how a certain kind of certain choice ended up, kind of playing out in the course of the work. And I feel like when I get to that point, maybe I'm finally reaching a sort of conclusion, right? Where like the character is alive sufficiently in their head that it's, someone can actually argue with their life choices or with their perspective, but they are kind of fully conjured into being, right? If that makes sense.
Well, are there any new directions or themes you might explore in your future works?
Yeah. Always working on projects. So I just at the conclusion of Bondage, I began another novel that I worked on for quite a while, and certainly want to bring that to fruition. But I think I reached this point halfway through where it's just, I had spent many years on one book, and I was in the middle of another project that was going to take maybe a few more years of my life. And so I found myself just kind of following my energy and was drawn to short fiction again for the first time in many years. So I just completed what I'm thinking of as a collection of short stories, 10 short stories, all set in with a common geographical theme of they're all again in Las Vegas and explore different kind of facets of life there. Some are kind of in that crime adjacent space, that noir adjacent space, like Bondage. Some are more horror or even sci-fi or literary. But anyways, that was really fun to kind of lose myself over the last year or so in these short stories, and to kind of be again in that kind of format where I can live with the story for, a few weeks, a few months or something, right? And then kind of have this nicely shaped 15 to 30 page thing, right? And move on to the next project. And again, I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier, but that that sense of approaching writing as like an exorcism, it's these ideas, these notions. I mean, I just have this like, I think I'm cursed with having too many ideas that I'll ever really get to approach in my lifetime, right? Just in terms of time with writing. So being able to sort of work through a dozen or so of them and kind of get those ideas, for better or worse, they're on the page now, and kind of excise them from my subconscious was really nice.
And I apologize for jumping back and forth here. I forgot before I moved on from the book, I wanted to ask you about your description of it on your social media as being feminist neo-noir. So with the classic tropes of classic noir, you've got, like, for instance, the femme fatale.
Yeah.
How do you subvert or address these tropes to align with feminist themes?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the character of Che herself, to me, was like kind of the big subversion point of that, right? I mean, she is a person who is marginalized and at the edge, and for all intents and purposes powerless, but isn't okay with accepting that role in life, right? And there's like I mentioned before, there's an overarching sort of theme in the book of male violence towards women, and whether through Buddy Flowers or the organization or other kind of strands in the book. And so for me, like the feminist edge to the book comes from Che, both because of the person who she is, but also the lessons she learned from her mother, not accepting that and fighting against these impossible odds, right? This organization with deep pockets and that manpower, and that has kind of the edge against her in all ways. But they have someone she cares about, a woman she cares about very much, and she's willing to give it all up, right, to fight against that.
All right. Well, it was a great story, great novel. Listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. And you mentioned before that you wrote a lot of short fiction, and you have a short story collection entitled Blood Spatter, a collection of crime horror short stories set within the world of your novel, Bondage. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Blood Spatter came about sort of a happy coincidence. I mean, in the aftermath of writing Bondage, I had realized, I had cut so much of the book in service to the overall story as it was presented, right, into the world. And there were, looking at all the darlings I had killed, I mean, there were, scenes and situations and characters and plot lines that I thought in and of themselves worked, and had a place within the world that the story was inhabiting. But the novel as in and of itself worked better, without those, and had more of a kind of a direct through line. So that was the spark for me to take some of those and work them into their own flash fiction short pieces. So Blood Spatter is composed of a half dozen stories, some just a few pages, some upwards of, 8-9 pages might be the longest one, that all take place within, concurrently within the world of Bondage. And some of the stories are running, in parallel to the events of Bondage. A couple of them operate as prequel sort of devices, looking more into like the shadowy Machiavellian maneuvers of the organization. There's even one that's, a bit of a sequel, follows the PI Navarro immediately after the events of Bondage. So yeah, it's about a 60-page short collection of short stories. That is, I made it available. So many of the stories have been published in different magazines online, like Shotgun Honey, Punk Noir magazine, some other great publications. but I collected them into their own book, Blood Spatter, which is available for free to anyone who wants to read it. It's accessible. The PDF is accessible, electronic form of the book. Once you subscribe to my newsletter via Substack.
All right. Kind of alluding back to talking about Cormac McCarthy, you have a post on your social media in regard to him that says, quote, "As a writer, parent, human, Cormac McCarthy's voice on the utter meaninglessness of it all moves and terrifies me. If you could assign your own meaning to life, what would it be?"
Wow. Yeah, that's a heavy question. I think with McCarthy, it's like, it is that sense of the indifference of the universe and the ways in which we move within that, right? And we have connections and, live our days within that kind of larger void. So I guess, to me, that speaks to me in terms of our place in the universe, right? But I think within that, even if that there is no, ultimate grand narrative to those things, and even if we are all destined to be forgotten, right? You think of how quickly that's going to be, right? Like, your parents, your grandparents, maybe your great grandparents, right? After that, everyone's just a story, right? That gets increasingly hazy, and that's going to happen to us as well, right? But at the same time, I don't use that as a pretext to kind of steer away from all sense of morality or duty in life. I think of myself as a deeply moral person when it comes to my own personal life and my kind of day-to-day life. And so I think, I found myself kind of organically, this came about, I think, through the character of Che, right? Where it's like you find your own guidestone, your own meaning in life, right? In a way, while I'm not necessarily this way, I think Che's path is one where she's ultimately anti-family, or the book itself is kind of an anti-family book insofar as not giving yourself blindly to the family and the world and the causes in which, like, you've kind of been brought up, but to find your own meaning and to ascribe your own meaning in life. So I guess, this is kind of a circuitous way of explaining that, but I guess it's just finding your own guidestone, your own connections in life, the people who are meaningful to you, people you love, the causes and the values, right? That the positive change you want to affect in the world, however you can. The ways in which you can most meaningfully fill your days and your activities.
All right. Well, final question. What is the life of Joaquin Jimenez like outside of writing?
Yeah. So we were chatting a little bit about, where we were calling in from, ahead of the call. So I lived in Las Vegas for a long time, lived across, many places in the US, live currently up in Canada, in Victoria, British Columbia on Vancouver Island. I'm in my 40s. I turned 43 tomorrow, in fact. I'm married. I have, young kids, so you can kind of probably assume picture the middle-aged life, I lead there. It's funny thinking about it, though, because it's like, my life outside of writing, because whether it's a benefit or a curse, I find, there's not a whole lot of life without writing, even when I'm not tip-tapping away at the keyboard or jotting down in a notebook. It's writing is something that has always, ever since I discovered it when I was, 12, 13 years old, it's always been there in my life. And so I find myself, especially as I get older and just, obligations and duties sort of pile up, right? I have less and less time to actually just kind of put pen to paper. But I find myself always thinking about writing, always dreaming of these worlds and these characters and whatever project I have near at hand. Right now is one of those kind of almost joyous moments where I'm between projects. I mentioned I finished this book of manuscript of short stories that I'm just kind of letting sit there, and I'm trying to shop some of those stories out, but just like kind of letting it percolate a little bit. And I have that novel that I'm a few hundred pages into that I wanted to jump back into, but I'm just trying to extend this kind of brief respite as long as I can, and just kind of let my I don't know, not let my mind fall fallow, but just like let my subconscious just kind of work right now.
It's kind of a Control Alt Delete.
Yeah. It's nice. I mean, it's writing is such an can be an all-consuming thing. And like I mentioned, it's like even when I'm not, staring into Microsoft Word, it's like I'm still in the shower or in my life, always thinking about writing. And so it's, nice to have those moments where you can kind of try to pull back a little bit and just be a present human being in the world.
Absolutely. Well, Shane, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been a really fun conversation, and just really touched you inviting me to join you on the show.
Anytime. Well, as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about? I know you've revealed quite a bit. Maybe some things you want to reiterate?
Yeah, sure. You can find me online in a few different places, but maybe I'll point you first and foremost to my Substack newsletter. So it's just my full name, Shane Joaquin Jimenez, one long word with many vowels, .substack.com. You can also go to my website, shanejoaquinjimenez.com, which kind of points you in different directions. I'm active on Instagram and on both those forums on my website, and also on my Substack, post just different craft thoughts and stuff I'm working on and stuff I'm getting published out there. So if you read Bondage and liked it and you want to read more, there's Blood Spatter, which you can access through my Substack, and always posting new stuff I'm working on there.
Awesome. Well, Shane, please do stick around after we disconnect here so I can give you some information real quick. But listeners at home, all of those things he just mentioned will be linked in the description. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, both live and on demand. And Shane, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can watch the episodes live. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest writers and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.